Okay, welcome to our lecture material on pathways to parenthood. And I'll be attempting to kind of synthesize and summarize some of our reading material this week and also extend it with some additional information. So the total fertility rate is the number of births per 1,000 women ages 15 to 24. And the United States and most developed countries have been below the the replacement rate of 2.1 for quite some time. So 2.1 is the replacement rate in order to maintain the same amount of our population. So more recently we fell to 1.73, which is our lowest since the 1970s, and this is partially attributed to the Great Recession. It's mainly due to higher rates of contraception use, not so much due to decreases in sexual frequency, although there might be some of that too. The vast majority of the declines are for younger women, under 30 and less educated women, and we are seeing increases in fertility rates for older women and more educated women. So the interesting thing about the total fertility rate, or TFR, is that a lower total fertility rate in a country contributes to a rising OADR, or the old age dependency ratio. And you can see that depicted there. That's the number of persons ages 65 or older, basically divided by the working population, people ages 20 to 64. And so the bottom number is, in effect, paying into government taxes that go to Social Security, or paying into retirement funds or Medicare, or maybe even just directly supporting taking care of their family members. And so having a rising OADR is challenging for countries, because basically you have a growing older population that is supported by a decreasing working population. But in the United States, even though our total fertility rate is pretty low, it's less of an issue because we have higher rates of immigration, both documented and undocumented, and immigrants usually come when they're younger, not when they're older. So even though our total fertility rate is declining, which is true, some of this has to do with a big part of a delay in childbirth. So this graph doesn't show first births, but all births. And so what you can see from this is there's steep declines in teen births. There's also declines in births to women in their 20s, although the majority of births do still happen to women in their 20s. And yet birth rates are increasing for women ages 30 and up. And having children in your 30s or early 40s is nothing new. When women routinely had 4 or 5 children, many bore their last child in their 30s or even 40s. What's new is the increasing trend towards postponing first births into that later age range. So, why are we delaying childbearing? Well, if you're hoping to be married when you have kids, then also that increasing age of marriage is contributing. Also, we have women with more kind of educational and career opportunities who may be opting to delay childbearing. There's benefits, pretty big benefits to delaying childbearing, because by then you can have more social support, you have more career stability, more economic stability, and able to kind of provide more academic and psychosocial, resources for children. But the costs are, the risks of infertility and pregnancy complications, and also child disorders as both the biological mother and father age. So we've talked about this before, but we're seeing an uncoupling of marriage and childbearing. And in fact, the mean age at first birth is a little bit lower than the mean age of first marriage, which indicates that people are delaying marriage or not marrying, more likely to do that than they are to delay their first child or not have a child. And so, as we've talked about 40% of births are non-marital, and again, those are mainly to cohabiting couples rather than to single mothers. So you can see from this graph, the married couples with children is declining, but married couples without children is staying about the same. So the reason for the decline in married couples with children is because less people who are marrying, less people who have kids are getting married, and so they may be either cohabiting or living alone. Okay, so I found the changes in this area pretty fascinating in terms of childless women in the U.S., and these could be voluntary or involuntary, and we'll talk about this more. So that's usually calculated by the percentage of women between ages 40 and 44 who are still childless, with the idea that maybe they're kind of at the end of childbearing and would have had a child at this point. And so you can see that we peaked at 20% of women at that age being childless in about 2006, and now we've been declining down to about 15% in 2014. And these declines have happened across all education levels, but you can see the most dramatic declines are for highly educated women. And so whereas it may have been in the past, highly educated women felt like they could not have kids and kind of maintain, a career maybe that goes with high education, we're seeing shifts in that now, which is a good sign. So voluntarily childless individuals, sometimes called child-free, right, are about half of childless women. And what we also know is that childless young adults, whether that's men or women, do report kind of higher emotional well-being when they're young adults. But by midlife, midlife adults with kids and without kids have similar levels of well-being. So basically it's just that having kids is hard, and it's easier to be happy in your 20s and 30s when you don't have kids, and it's harder when you do have kids. But generally people who do have kids kind of catch up in levels of happiness in midlife. At the end of life, males who are above 70 who are both childless and unmarried do report more loneliness. Unmarried childless women seem to do fairly well later in life, but it sort of also depends on whether or not they wanted to have kids or didn't want to have kids. So moving on to talk about intended and then unintended pregnancies. So intended pregnancies are predicted by some economic factors like financial security, having access to secure housing, having a stable income. And for heterosexual couples, some factors that have influenced their decisions are whether or not the male partner has high enough earnings and whether or not the female partner feels as if she can balance work and family. And so this kind of harkens back to this separate spheres ideology that's been in existence for a couple of hundred years, where we think of, in heterosexual couples, males as more of the breadwinners and females as more of the home care providers. Even though that's shifted a lot, it's interesting that it's still kind of, we have vestiges of that showing up. Okay, so moving on to unintended pregnancies and births. So these declined from a little over half to more like 45% in 2011, and that's the most current data I've been able to find so far. About 60% of unintended pregnancies are carried to full term. And so then about 1/3 of all births that happen are unintended. And over all of their childbearing years, about half of mothers will have at least one unattended birth. If they have a college education, then that goes down to about 1/3 of mothers. So unintended pregnancies and births are more likely for less educated women and men, sexual minority females, interestingly, and women in less stable relationships, because that's correlated with lower use of consistent contraception. And then the graph just reminds us that unintended pregnancies are most likely to happen to women ages 20 to 34, so a smaller amount to teens and to women over the age of 35. So let's talk about contraception and how it relates to childbearing. And what we can see is that there's some trends between more educated women and some differences between more educated women and less educated women. So more educated women on average will report more knowledge about contraceptive options, more comfort with them, more access to, and more trust in their medical providers. Whereas less educated women will report less of all those things. And Black women also report less comfort and less access. More educated women will report higher efficacy, or a sense that they can control their own fertility, whereas less educated women will report higher fatalism, or a sense that they can't control it, it's out of their hands. And Black women also report higher attitudes of fatalism. More educated women will report more clear and consistent goals about kind of their plans and the timing of getting pregnant and having kids. And less educated women report higher ambivalence about childbearing. So for example, maybe being younger and on the one hand thinking I shouldn't get pregnant because I'm so young, but on the other hand feeling like a baby could offer meaning and purpose in the absence of kind of a clear kind of educational and career path. Some other notes are that contraceptive use, especially condoms, is higher in the early stages of relationships, and it becomes less consistent as the relationship progresses. Perhaps because it is associated with contraception is associated with less commitment and less trust, and so it gets kind of confusing what the meaning of contraception is in some relationships. And so this is where, long-acting reversible contraceptives like such as IUDs and implants might kind of take away kind of that meaning around, if you want me to wear a condom, it means you don't trust me or we're not really committed. Okay, as we're hearing in our media right now, abortion rates have declined in recent years, and this graph is specifically for teens ages 15 to 19, which have showed the steepest declines. It's estimated that 1 in 4 women will have an abortion in their lifetime, but this is really underreported due to the stigma. So abortion providers report higher rates of abortion than women who are surveyed. For the women who do report having had an abortion, the majority state they are already mothers, so it's not a first pregnancy. Okay, so less than 1% of new children joining a family is due to adoption versus biological birth, so it's not as common, significantly. And unrelated adoptions, so non-family adoptions, have been declining since the 1970s. There's currently 3 pathways: adopting a child through a public agency in the foster care system, adopting a child through a private domestic or United States adoption agency, and adopting a child through a private international adoption agency, which rates had been going up on that for quite a few years, but now are declining. And so the pros of private adoptions are that they are generally faster as compared to public adoptions. They're faster and parents have more choice, but the cons are that they're more expensive and they have more restrictions, especially based on whether or not someone is a sexual or gender minority or a single parent. So talking for a minute about infertility treatments, or what's called assisted reproductive technology, or ART. There's a number of different things, and we won't go into detail on those, but it's things like in vitro fertilization or IVF, which does include ovarian stimulation and insemination procedures, but you can also do those, separately from IVF. And then increasingly, more highly educated women are choosing some egg freezing to stop basically the biological clock. It's not actually it's not fertilizing eggs, but just freezing them for later use. It's unclear how effective egg freezing is right now, but it is a growing trend, again, among educated women. Infertility treatments are increasing, but they're still pretty rare. Less than 2% of births used, and used fertility treatment, and less than 50% of women who have experienced fertility issues have reported that they or their partner have used fertility treatments. We also know that there's less infertility services provided to Black and Hispanic women as compared to white women, even controlling for education, income, and insurance. And so it could be that this is, some discrimination in our healthcare systems. It could also be some sort of kind of attitudes around infertility treatments as well. So I do think, because I teach a grief and loss class, it's just worth mentioning around some of these issues, the grief that goes with them. So at my age, I've obviously known a lot of my friends who have experienced the grief associated with infertility, and research really supports this, that it can really take its toll emotionally and psychologically. You can experience lower self-esteem. You can kind of question your worth as a female or a male, kind of this sense of what's wrong with me. It can create a strain for couples. You can go through multiple kind of roller coasters around getting your hopes up that a fertility treatment will work, and then perhaps grief when the IVF fails. And that which can happen multiple times. And so in a sense, it's like experiencing a miscarriage in some ways every time the IVF treatment fails. And really people are putting their life plans on hold, right? They're not taking expensive trips because IVF can be around $10,000 each time, and it's not covered by insurance or Medicaid. And so people are not taking trips. They're not remodeling their homes. They're not moving. They're not making changes to their jobs. Not making long-term plans because they don't know if they're going to be getting pregnant or not. And then it's also just worth talking more about the grief associated with pregnancy and loss. And so abortion is obviously a very stigmatized loss, and yet one that women still experience a lot of grief, can experience a lot of grief over, even if it was an intentional decision. Same with adoption, that even though a woman might decide to place a baby for adoption, she can grieve this baby, for the rest of her life, for example, on that baby's birthday or at other times. Miscarriages, which are the death of embryos or fetuses before the halfway mark, before 20 weeks, are super common. They're about 10 to 25% of identified pregnancies, and probably more women who don't even know that they are pregnant and maybe just have a little bit of a heavier period. Stillbirth is less common, about 1% of pregnancies, and that's over 20 weeks. That's pretty shocking because it is less common and a baby has grown quite a bit more, so that can be particularly difficult. And so the challenges with this are, for example, it's an ambiguous loss. So people don't know, did they lose a child or not? Are they parents or not? Are they a real man or are they a real woman? It's also disenfranchised by our society. So we're getting better at this, but we haven't historically recognized miscarriage and stillbirth as the loss of a child or as a death. And so there's not as much kind of structural support. Maybe people are expected back at work kind of right away. We are getting better kind of in our hospitals and allowing women, for example, with miscarriages and stillbirths to be able to hold the baby that has died, that they've given, birth to, and maybe some rituals to take footprints or pictures instead of just kind of taking the baby away and saying that they'll just, take care of it. So I think we're changing in this, but it's still something where, people often aren't getting kind of acknowledged for this type of loss. Okay, so now I want to switch gears and talk about some of the racial disparities in prenatal care and infant mortality in the United States. Okay, so So I encourage you to watch about 5 minutes of this TED Talk watch from about 6.5 minutes to 11.5 minutes by Miriam Zola Perez that's on Jenny Joseph and the JJ Way, and that's Jenny Joseph kind of pictured here. And the idea is that racism basically is a contributing factor to why persons of color might not feel comfortable seeking prenatal care, or might not have as high quality prenatal care. And we might see similar patterns also for transgender people who would be more at risk for not getting kind of adequate prenatal care. So let's talk about infant mortality. Mortality means death in developed countries. And again, remember, most infant mortality is neonatal mortality, or newborn mortality, dying, right around the time of birth or shortly thereafter. And what you can see is that compared to other developed countries, we have higher rates. We're not doing so great. And you've probably figured that out by now. You've learned in other classes that even though we think we're pretty awesome here in the US, on a lot of things related to health, we don't do as well as our European nation counterparts. Okay, so this graph also shows mortality rates associated with race and ethnicity. And you can see here that mortality rates in the United States are lowest for Hispanic babies and highest for non-Hispanic Black babies. Mortality rates are overall declining, from 2000, but we can see some disparities there associated with race. So this shows us the causes of infant death associated with different racial or Hispanic origin ethnicity categories. And I've highlighted some kind of numbers there to take note that basically for Black babies, the leading cause of death is that they are premature or low birth weight. There can also be complications in the birth process later, SIDS or accidents. You can see also high rates of congenital birth defects for Native American babies. So in recent years, we've had some particular attention paid to African American mothers in particular, and kind of the disparities in the birth process. And so sometimes people have asked, could it be because of various factors that don't have to do with the color of the skin? So here's some research kind of comparing Black and white mothers in terms of infant mortality rates. And so what you can see here is it doesn't seem to be related to, it doesn't seem to be explained by marital status, because Black married mothers still have an infant mortality rate that's double that of white married mothers. It also doesn't seem to be something that's just maybe younger Black women giving birth. So you can see that the rates of infant mortality are quite a bit higher, even more than double, if you are an African American woman over the age of 25 as compared to a white woman. And then these charts also show the disparity based on education and prenatal care. So sometimes what people have suggested is, the race disparity could be explained actually by money, that it's about low SES, so less money or less education. But what you can see here is that Black mothers are still, even those with graduate degrees, are still twice as likely compared to white women at similar levels of education to have a baby die. So much higher infant mortality rates even for more educated African American women. And it's not just about access to prenatal care. So women who don't get access to prenatal care, still among those Black women's babies are more likely to die. So then people have wondered if it was about genetics. And so research has looked at basically when a mother immigrates from an African country, what is her baby's birth weight or risk of, birth weight basically, right after she immigrates compared to later generations. And what you can see there is that Babies of African and Caribbean born mothers have babies that weigh more than Black African American babies, yet their daughters will give birth that are lower birth weight than their own. And we don't see the same trend for European immigrants. Their birth, when they come to the United States, their babies are actually a higher birth weight than the birth weight of their mothers. So it's now being questioned as to whether or not higher rates of Black infant mortality are associated with kind of the cumulative effects of economic and social discrimination. And this is called the weathering hypothesis, that basically Black mothers have a deterioration in their health due to kind of accumulated stress. And Black women do show higher what's called allostatic load, or various biomarkers of stress, things like blood pressure, BMI, cholesterol, compared to white females and males or Black males. And in fact, and it's not just about money, because poor whites have a lower allostatic load than non-poor Blacks. And so there's been a suggestion that perhaps there's toxic stress that is taking its effect on Black women and their ability to have a healthy weight baby that's not so at risk. We don't yet have, this is more of a hypothesis, we don't have clear research kind of indicating this. It could be something more about, the American diet interacting with, racial features, but this is, current thinking.